Okay, hello, Troy Howarth. Please tell people out there a little bit about the Damiano Damiani film, Confessions of a Police Captain.
Well, it is part of a group of sort of politically charged films that Damiani made throughout the late 60s and throughout the 70s, even into the 80s as well, usually very often dealing with the mafia in some
Mhm.
form or another, but also dealing with kind of criticizing various different power structures and so forth in Italian politics and Italian society and so forth. And the film deals with a police captain played by Martin Balsam, who is, to test a cliche, he's not above breaking the law in order to uphold it. And he
Mhm.
uses some methods that could be seen as unorthodox, but always with a good cause in mind. But his antics attract the attention of a young, ambitious assistant district attorney played by Franco Nero,
Mhm.
and inevitably they come to loggerheads. And yeah, that's pretty much the dramatic arc of the film. And the Balsam character is very focused on bringing down a local mob kind of kingpin,
Mhm.
played by Luciano Catanacci, and is determined to do whatever he needs to do in order to make that happen.
Mhm. What do you think works about this film?
Well, what I like best about it, revisiting it recently, because I'd seen the film before several years ago, and it was a film that I came to um, with kind of a general attitude towards it from a lot of people when the film first kind of came out over here on DVD was, oh, it's a bit boring, it's a bit dry, it's not very exciting. And if you look at it as a kind of typical Italian poliziesco film, which again, these are very politically charged films, but a lot of those films were more action oriented. I could see where if you come into this expecting lots of car chases and things like that, it might seem a little underwhelming, but it's not that at all. It's much more thoughtful, much more sedate and introspective kind of film. So what I really appreciate about it is how even-handed it is in its presentation of its two central characters. It would have been very easy to have presented either the Balsam character or the Nero character in completely sympathetic or unsympathetic way. But what Damiani does extremely well throughout the movie is kind of test our sympathies. It's a back and forth that goes on through the film. It reminds me a little bit of what Ronald Neame achieved in a film from 1960 called Tunes of Glory, which is another kind of two-hander film with Alec Guinness and John Mills playing, the heads of this sort of battalion of Scottish soldiers. And the one character is very sort of stiff and by the book and kind of unsympathetic. And the other one is very gregarious. He's outgoing. He likes to have a good time and treats the men in a particularly kind of warm fashion, whereas the other guy is much more sort of chilly and foreboding. And in that film too, your sympathies are constantly shifting. You find yourself questioning why you feel warmly towards one character and coldly towards another, and it goes back and forth throughout, which I think is very interesting. And I think Damiani does something that's very similar in this film, and that's one of the things I really appreciated is that the Balsam character and the Nero character, they're both very well delineated. They're both complex, and I think ultimately it's possible to see the good as well as the bad in them both.
Mm, very nice. And what should people keep in mind when checking this out for the first time?
Well, I'd say anybody who is coming to it who's familiar with these other Polizieski films of the 70s, if your idea of a kind of Polizieski is very much along the lines of something like Deodato's Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man, or an Umberto Lenzi movie like Violent Naples or The Tough Ones. It's not that type of picture. It is slower, it's more thoughtful, it's more nuanced. It's not to say that there isn't nuance in those other films. There is. There is a subtext to those films, and they do have their point of view that they're putting across. But they do so within the guise of a kind of high octane action oriented
Hmm.
type picture where you get lots of, again, car chases, broad characters. Usually the police commissioner figure is, like the Balsam characters, prone to testing the waters of what's legal or ethical, but in a more cartoonish, excessive way in these films. So lots of kind of slapping women around and beating up hippies and things like that, which you don't get in this film. This is a very different type of film. So I'd say if you're going into it expecting something like that, and I suppose the English title for the film, Confessions of a Police Captain, might also kind of put some people in mind of those kind of very dated 70s sex comedies, Confessions of a window cleaner and things like that. Don't expect something along those lines. It's not that at all. So I would say go in with kind of realistic expectations and expect to have something that I think is very haunting, and really leaves you with a lot of questions rather than answers.
Heck yes. I think I wanna do this, like, totally blank, and I loved it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite scene in the film?
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier. I mean, there's a lot of great scenes. The ending of the film is particularly powerful, I think. I don't want to spoil for people who haven't seen it. I
Yeah.
mean, I understand it's a 53-year-old movie, but there's a lot of people who haven't seen it, so I won't
Yeah.
say. But I think the ending's very effective. Both parts of the ending, because there was one ending and then it kind of goes into something else. And I think that's, both very effective. But I think really the scene that I really appreciate and that I really probably would pick as my favorite is the big confrontation that takes
Yeah.
place kind of overlooking the Italian countryside between Balsam and Nero, where they're finally kind of out, away from the offices, away from all of their peers, all prying eyes and so forth, and everything just kind of comes out in the open. Their mutual sort of prejudices,
Mm.
their mutual kind of distaste for each other, but also a certain grudging respect that ultimately there is some crossover there that they can kind of find common ground. But ultimately, their methods are very different. So I think probably that would be my favorite scene.
That's definitely my favorite scene. That's the one I remember after all these years.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's
So
beautifully played by both of them.
oh, certainly. It, definitely I hadn't really noticed, hadn't thought of that, but the background certainly plays a huge role in that too.
Yeah, I mean it definitely, they're talking about the future of the country effectively. So you're kind of, you're out there, you're surrounded by the natural world, but there's kind of symbols of the city and so forth in the distance and so forth. So there's a real sense of something that's bigger than themselves and more important than themselves that they may not have an opportunity to really salvage. But again, coming at it from very different perspectives.
Yeah. So Franco Nero's character goes through some big changes in this movie and sort of a rude awakening, I would say. Did you find yourself relating to this rude awakening in any sort of way?
Well, I mean, it again. The movie touches on a lot of really interesting moral and ethical kinds of questions, and it's that question of, what is the difference between the law and justice? This sense of we
Yeah.
have a set of rules that are in place notionally, anyway, for the idea of kind of keeping us being civilized and keeping us from tearing each other from limb. um, but ultimately, there is that question too of, do these rules and regulations sometimes kind of get in the way of real justice in certain
Mm.
situations? I think this is something that unfortunately is still very timely. Again, 53, this film came out in 71.
Yeah.
So 53 years later, we're still dealing with these ethical questions. And that idea of how should the law function? Should it just be a very black and white thing, which is what Franco Nero's character kind of favors, or should it be something that is more flexible and more dependent on context and situation? Is something just bad down the line, and that's all there is to it? Or
Hmm.
is it a very much a situational thing? Like, well, okay, normally we wouldn't say this is okay, but in this particular situation, maybe it's excusable. So I can understand I can relate to the character's kind of struggle with trying to find a definitive answer to that. And I think ultimately my own position is that I don't think that it's something that I can really say across the board is always readily visible and clear and obvious. I think a lot of these things are much more situational and contextual. And again, there obviously there are certain things that are inexcusable, but very often this idea of what is necessary in order to sort of protect the greater good is it's a tricky and ambiguous question.
So, Radiance Films put out a box set of some of these other films called
Yeah.
Cosa Nostra, Franco Nero, and Three Mafia Tales by Damiano Damiani. Do you own this set? Do you want to own this set?
Yeah, oh yeah, I have it.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Damiani in general.
Oh yeah.
He's a director who he's an interesting one because he is kind of an art house figure in a way, but he was one of those directors who worked in kind of genre cinema.
Hmm.
So it was kind of it was a more nuanced, as I said before, slightly more high-minded,
Hmm.
highbrow kind of approach that he was taking, but more geared towards a kind of genre type sensibility. I mean, he even directed the second Amityville film, which is incredibly
Oh,
strange movie to find on his CV. But
I didn't know that.
I think yeah, no, he direct. Well, it was De Laurentiis produced it, and he was a safe pair of hands, so
Fair,
they
fair.
got him to direct it, which is kind of a wonderful film in many respects. At least the first half of it is terrific.
Hmm.
The second half turns into kind of an Exorcist clone, but it's still good. Certainly the best of the Amityvilles, I think, by a long mile. So he's always kind of he's had a good, solid reputation among kind of scholars of Italian film, but yet he's never been quite as celebrated and quite as embraced as some of his peers. He's kind of trapped. He's kind of like reminds me a little bit of Elio Petri, the director of Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion, amongst other films. In that these are directors who they're working in a way within commercial genres, but they're not necessarily making the most commercial examples of those genres. They're a little bit different.
Hmm.
So anything Damiani has directed, I'm interested in seeing. And when I saw that Radiance was putting out that box set, yes, I wasted no time picking it up.
I believe it. And there are a bunch of interviews in there where there's some featurettes there that you particularly enjoyed.
I mean, I always enjoy seeing Franco Nero interviewed. He's always a thoughtful and engaging, I think, interview subject. They did have some archival stuff, including Damiani himself, I believe, on at least one of the discs. I can't recall for sure, but that was obviously nice to see. It was a very well put together set, I would say. The three films, Day of the Owl, which is his first film about the mafia from the late '60s. Franco Nero and Lee J. Cobb and Claudia Cardinale. I mean, you can't go wrong with
Wow,
that.
what a cast!
Uh, Great cast. The second one was The Case is Closed, Forget It, which has Nero, Riccardo Cucciola, and John Steiner. And that's probably my favorite of the three films in that set.
Ooh.
Really hard hitting film. Not really about the mafia so much, that one.
Hmm.
But again, dealing with kind of the problems of the penal system in Italy, and then the third one, oh, I don't have it sitting right here in front
How
of me.
to
How to
Kill a
Kill a
Judge.
Judge. How to Kill a Judge, which is a
Yeah.
very interesting film that, again, when it came out back in the, I guess, early 2000s for the first time over here on DVD, oh, so many people were, oh God, this movie is so boring. Oh my God. And
Yeah.
it's not, it really isn't at all. I don't
Right.
think it's boring at all. But if you're,
Mm.
again, if you're expecting that kind of that kind of schlockier approach,
Mm.
it probably would seem a little bit stuffy. But no, I don't think it's boring at all.
And do you enjoy A Bullet for the General, his spaghetti western?
Yeah, that's one of the kind of so-called Zapata westerns that all
Right.
deal with the Mexican Revolution. And of course, those were heavily, heavily coded to be dealing also with Italian sort of political issues of the period. So, not surprisingly, Gian Maria Volante plays a crucial role in that film. Volante, after a certain point, chose not to work with Sergio Leone anymore because Leone wasn't a politically committed filmmaker. The only real political film he ever made was Duck You Sucker, which carries the
Mm-hmm.
message "Don't get involved," and that was appalling to people like Volante. Was a very very committed leftist,
Uh-huh.
communist, and very very high minded ideals and so forth. So yeah, that made sense that they should work together on that film. It's a really really good one. Klaus Kinski's great in it too.
Oh yeah.
Great role for him. And speaking of Damiani working with Volante, a movie that has not come out over here
Ooh.
on Blu-ray yet, and I hope it does at some point. It's a terrific movie. It's called I Am Afraid.
Okay.
It stars Volante, and that is a terrific film that I hope will get a release at some point.
Well, geez, hopefully someone from Severin or Vinegar Syndrome is listening to this, or anyone. Let's make it happen.
I've recommended it to numerous labels. I hope somebody at some point will pick it up. It's really really good.
Cool, cool. If you could ask Franco Nero one question about Confessions of the Police Captain, what would it be?
I actually have had the pleasure of interviewing him in the past.
Oh,
I interviewed him probably about close to a decade ago
oh,
for my
cool.
book on Lucio Fulci, and unfortunately, the topic of this movie did not come up. But
No.
um, I did have a very pleasant, I think about hour and a half talk with
Wow.
him on the phone with his very unmistakable voice, which is unfortunately not present on the English dub of this film. He was dubbed, I think, by Michael Forrest in this one.
Oh,
Um, I think if I were going to ask him anything, I'd probably the same question I would love to have asked Martin Balsam, which is
uh,
how closely did you identify with the kind of politics and the kind of ethical position of your character?
all right.
I think that
Yeah.
would be interesting to hear.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Troy, thanks so much for your time. It's always a great joy to talk to you. I really appreciate your time. And tell me about well, not just me, tell everyone about some Blu-rays you were featured on this year that you're excited for people to check out when they're for things that have been announced, of course.
Um, it's hard for me to keep track. I know the
Right.
88 Films, the UK label, they are just now putting out their 4K of Count Dracula, the Jess Franco Count
Nice.
Dracula. Long time in coming, so I'm very excited that's coming out. I did a commentary for that with Nathaniel Thompson. Speaking of Franco, we also did one for The Bloody Judge,
Nice.
which they put out as Night of the Blood Monster, unfortunately, but that is one of the film's titles.
Uh-huh.
Um, as a matter of fact, I just within recent days got comp copies of Death Dream from Blue Underground,
Okay.
the Bob Clark movie, kind of a
Yeah.
modern day variation on The Monkey's Paw. Great film.
It is. Yeah.
Um, and Kinski's Paganini.
All right.
Yeah, from Vinegar Syndrome, and also from Vinegar Syndrome, Witch Story, a late 80s Italian horror film featuring the Scottish actor Ian Bannon, of all people, Oscar nominee for Flight of the Phoenix. So those have all recently come out, and there's a lot of stuff to come. It's hard for me to remember what's been announced and what hasn't. I know the Doomed Houses box set from Cauldron Films has been
Mhm.
announced. That has four late
Oh yeah.
period films by Lucio Fulci and Umberto Lenzi.
Looks pretty
So
cool.
yeah, I think people will be happy with it. It's the first time those films have had a really nice release, and very happy to be a part of it. So yeah, that's some of them anyway.
That's a lot of stuff.
It's enough.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.